At 11:30 a.m. on January 16, 1942, Chief Aviation Machinist Mate Harold Dixon pushed the throttle forward on his Douglas TBD Devastator torpedo bomber, watching the gray expanse of the Pacific Ocean stretch endlessly beneath his wings as USS Enterprise disappeared behind him. 41 years old, enlisted pilot with 16 years of Navy service, flying a reconnaissance mission 200 miles ahead of the carrier strike force, with two men who trusted him to bring them home. The Japanese Imperial Navy controlled most of the Central Pacific by mid-January 1942, with patrol submarines and surface raiders operating within 500 miles of every American carrier position. Dixon checked his fuel gauge. The Devastator burned fuel at 85 gallons per hour. He had launched with a full load of 180 gallons. The math was simple and unforgiving. In his rear cockpit sat 22-year-old Radioman 3rd Class Gene Aldrich from Sikeston, Missouri, manning the radio set that would guide them back to Enterprise. Below him, lying in the bombardier position with his face pressed to the bomb sight window, was 24-year-old Aviation Ordnanceman 2nd Class Tony Pastula from Youngstown, Ohio. The mission briefing had been straightforward. Scout 200 miles northwest, look for Japanese submarines, maintain radio silence to protect the carrier, return in 3 hours. Dixon had flown this type of patrol dozens of times since Pearl Harbor. The Devastator was slow, with a top speed of 206 miles per hour, and it was already obsolete in January 1942. But it was reliable. The Navy trusted it. Dixon trusted it. An hour into the patrol, something changed. The wind shifted. Dixon felt it immediately. The Devastator started drifting south. He made a correction. Then another. The navigation became harder. The Pacific looked the same in every direction. No islands, no ships, just water and clouds and the occasional whitecap on the surface below. Aldrich tried to raise Enterprise on the radio. Static. He adjusted the frequency. More static. The carrier had moved, or the Devastator had drifted farther than Dixon realized. Either way, they were alone in the largest ocean on Earth with no radio contact and fuel burning away at 85 gallons per hour. Dixon made a decision. Turn east, head back toward where Enterprise should be. Keep the fuel mixture lean, fly at the most efficient altitude, stretch every gallon as far as it would go. He checked the fuel gauge again. Half full, maybe 90 gallons left. Enough for just over an hour of flight time. Pastula called up from the bombardier station. He had spotted something on the horizon. Dixon looked. Nothing. Just more ocean. Pastula insisted. Dixon banked the Devastator. Still nothing. The fuel gauge dropped lower. 70 gallons. Then 60. The sun climbed higher in the sky. The Pacific remained empty. At 1:15 p.m., the Pratt & Whitney radial engine coughed once. Dixon felt it through the control stick. The cough came again. The fuel gauge showed 15 gallons, maybe 20 minutes of flight time remaining. No carrier in sight, no land, no ships. Nothing but water stretching to the horizon in every direction. If you want to see how Dixon brought his crew through what came next, please hit that like button. It helps us share more stories like this one. Subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Dixon. The engine coughed a third time. Dixon made his final decision. He ordered Aldrich to prepare the life raft. He told Pastula to gather every piece of survival gear they could carry. The Devastator had maybe 10 minutes of fuel left. The nearest land was over 400 miles away. The Pacific Ocean was 3 miles deep beneath them. Dixon began his descent toward the water. The engine was still running. He had one chance to put the bomber down safely. If the Devastator broke apart on impact, they would sink with it. If it flipped over, they would drown before getting the raft deployed. And if they survived the ditching, they would be floating in the open ocean with no radio, no rescue coming, and the Japanese Navy somewhere nearby hunting for American ships. The Devastator dropped lower. 200 feet. 100 feet. Dixon could see individual waves now. The ocean was rougher than it had looked from altitude. Dixon leveled the Devastator at 50 feet above the water. The waves were running 4 to 5 feet high. He picked a spot between two swells and cut the engine. The bomber glided for 3 seconds. Then the belly hit the Pacific. The impact threw Aldrich forward against his radio set. Pastula slammed into the bomb site. Dixon felt the control stick rip from his hands as the Devastator skipped once, twice, then settled into the water. The bomber floated for exactly 12 seconds. Dixon unbuckled and stood up in the cockpit. Water was already pouring in through the seams. Pastula passed him the yellow rubber life raft package. Dixon pulled the inflation cord. Nothing happened. He pulled again. The CO2 canister refused to trigger. The left wing started sinking. Dixon stepped onto it, still holding the uninflated raft. The wing tilted steeper. Then the wing went under. Dixon dropped into the Pacific Ocean up to his chest. The water was cold. Not freezing, but cold enough to steal his breath. He grabbed his life jacket and held onto the raft package with both hands. Behind him, the Devastator's tail lifted into the air. Aldrich and Pastula scrambled out of their positions. They had maybe 15 seconds before the bomber pulled them down. The Devastator sank like someone had opened a drain beneath it. Dixon watched the tail rise higher. Then the entire aircraft slipped beneath the surface and vanished. 3 miles of ocean opened up underneath them. Everything they had carefully assembled for survival went with the plane. The emergency radio, the flares, the survival rations, the water containers, all of it gone in less than 30 seconds. Dixon floated in his life jacket and looked at the raft package in his hands. It was still not inflated. Aldrich and Pastula treaded water nearby. The sun was directly overhead now. The swells lifted them up and dropped them down every few seconds. Dixon found the CO2 canister and tried the trigger mechanism again. This time it worked. The rubber began inflating. But it came up upside down. For the next 20 minutes, the 3 men struggled with the overturned raft while the Pacific swells knocked them in different directions. The raft was 4 feet wide and 8 feet long when properly inflated. Upside down, it was just a slippery rubber obstacle they could not flip over. Darkness was coming. Dixon knew that. They had maybe 2 hours of daylight left. Pastula had an idea. He pulled off his shirt and tied it to the cord that ran along the edge of the raft. Aldrich did the same. They made a crude rope from their shirts and threw it across the beam of the raft. Then they swam to the other side, found their rope, and pulled while bracing against the near edge. The leverage was enough. The raft flipped over and landed right side up on the water with a slap they could hear over the sound of the waves. All 3 men hauled themselves over the sides and collapsed on the rubber floor. They were inside the raft. They were alive. But they were in the middle of the Pacific Ocean with no way to signal for help and no idea where the nearest land might be. Dixon sat up and made an inventory. Aldrich had kept his pocket knife. Pastula had a police whistle. Dixon still had his service pistol, a .45 caliber automatic with 3 magazines. They had a small can of rubber cement for patching the raft. They had a pair of pliers. They had 2 pneumatic life jackets. And they had the wet clothes they were wearing. That was everything. No food, no water, no compass, no map, no radio. The sun dropped toward the horizon. The first night was coming. Dixon looked at his crew. Aldrich was shivering despite the tropical heat. Pastula was staring at the empty ocean around them. Neither man had said anything since climbing into the raft. The raft measured 80 inches long by 40 inches wide on the inside. 3 grown men in a space smaller than a twin mattress. Dixon tried to find a position where all 3 of them could lie down. It was impossible. Someone's legs always ended up on top of someone else. The rubber floor provided no cushioning. Every wave that hit the raft felt like someone striking the bottom with a baseball bat. Night fell. The temperature dropped. The swells grew larger. Water sloshed over the sides every few minutes. Dixon, Aldrich, and Pastula huddled together for warmth, but the wet clothes and constant spray from the waves made it impossible to get dry. None of them slept. The Pacific had them now, and the Pacific was just beginning to show them what 34 days without food or water would feel like. Dawn broke on January 17th. Dixon opened his eyes and saw nothing but ocean in every direction. The raft had drifted during the night. How far, he had no way to know. The three men were soaked from the spray and shivering despite the tropical latitude. Aldrich's lips were already cracking from the salt water. Pastula's face was bright red from the sun exposure the day before. Dixon understood their situation with complete clarity. USS Enterprise would search for them, but the carrier had no idea where they had gone down. The Devastator had been out of radio contact for over 2 hours before ditching. The search area would be massive, and Enterprise could not stay in one place too long. The Japanese were hunting for American carriers. Enterprise would search for maybe 2 days, then move on. At 9:20 a.m., they heard it, the sound of aircraft engines. Dixon looked up and saw a Navy dive bomber making a search pattern about half a mile to the north. All three men started waving their arms. Pastula blew the police whistle until his lungs gave out. Aldrich stripped off his white undershirt and waved it over his head. The dive bomber continued on its course and disappeared over the horizon. The pilot never saw them. The raft was yellow rubber on a gray-blue ocean. From 500 feet of altitude, it would look like a piece of debris or a whitecap on a wave. Dixon realized they were invisible to aerial search. Even if aircraft flew directly overhead, the chances of being spotted were almost zero. The Navy would search for another day, maybe 2. Then they would declare the crew lost at sea and move on. Thirst became the immediate problem. The human body can survive 3 weeks without food. It can only survive 3 to 4 days without water. All three men had swallowed salt water during the ditching and the struggle with the raft. The salt accelerated dehydration. By mid-morning on the 17th, Dixon's tongue felt thick in his mouth. Aldrich kept licking his lips, which only made the cracking worse. The sun climbed higher. There was no shade in the raft. The rubber absorbed heat and turned the interior into an oven. Dixon estimated the temperature inside the raft reached 110 degrees by noon. The men stripped down to their underwear to reduce heat retention. The sun burned their exposed skin immediately. Within 2 hours, all three had severe sunburn across their shoulders and backs. By late afternoon, Dixon made a decision about navigation. He knew the prevailing winds in the Central Pacific blew from east to west. If they drifted with the wind, they would eventually reach the Marshall or Gilbert Islands. But those islands were occupied by the Japanese. The alternative was to try steering south and east toward the Phoenix or Ellis Islands, which were still controlled by the British or Americans. The problem was they had no oars and no sail. Dixon took off his shoes. They were leather Navy-issue brogans, heavy and stiff. He showed Aldrich and Pastula how to use them as crude paddles. The men could reach over the side of the raft and pull water toward them, creating a slight directional force. It was exhausting work. After an hour of paddling with the shoes, all three men were gasping and their arms burned with fatigue. Dixon calculated they had moved the raft maybe 200 yards. At that rate, it would take months to reach land. The second night came. Still no water. The men's lips were badly cracked now. Dixon's mouth was so dry he could barely move his tongue. Aldrich lay in the bottom of the raft and stared at the stars. Pastula kept checking the horizon for ships that were not there. The swells continued to batter the raft every few seconds. Still, no one slept. January 18th arrived. 48 hours since the ditching. Still no rain. The sun rose and turned the raft into an oven again. Dixon knew the human body would start shutting down soon without water. Kidney function would fail first. Then confusion and hallucinations would begin. After that came unconsciousness and death. They had maybe 36 hours left before the thirst became fatal. At 2 p.m., dark clouds appeared on the eastern horizon. Dixon watched them build. A storm was coming. Storms meant rain. Rain meant water. But storms also meant high seas and wind that could flip the raft or tear it apart. The clouds moved closer. The wind picked up. The swells grew from 4 feet to 6 feet to 8 feet high. The storm hit the raft at 4:15 p.m. Rain came down in sheets. All three men opened their mouths and drank. The fresh water tasted like salvation. They had no containers to store it, so they drank as much as they could hold. The rain lasted 17 minutes. Then it stopped, and the clouds moved on. The storm had given them water, but it had also pushed the raft 50 miles farther from where Enterprise might still be searching. And it had ripped away one of Dixon's shoes that they had been using as a paddle. Now they had even less ability to control their direction. Night fell on January 18th. The men had water in their stomachs for the first time in 2 days, but they still had no food. And they still had no idea how far they were from land or how long the raft would hold together in the Pacific swells. January 19th. 3 days adrift. The thirst had returned with savage intensity. The brief rain had bought them time, but the human body processes water quickly in tropical heat. By mid-morning, all 3 men were desperate for moisture again. Dixon noticed Aldrich staring at the ocean with a strange expression. He recognized the look. The radio man was thinking about drinking salt water. Dixon had read the survival manuals. Drinking salt water would kill them faster than thirst. The salt would pull fluid from their cells and accelerate kidney failure. He told Aldrich to stop looking at the water. Aldrich nodded but kept staring anyway. The temptation was becoming overwhelming. Hunger joined the thirst. The human stomach can adapt to starvation over several days, but the initial hunger is agonizing. Dixon's stomach cramped constantly. Pastula kept swallowing as if trying to digest something that was not there. None of them had eaten since the morning of January 16th, over 70 hours ago. At midday on the 19th, fish appeared. A small school of them, maybe 20 or 30, swimming just beneath the surface around the raft. They were curious about this strange yellow object floating in their territory. The fish came close enough to touch. Aldrich reached over the side and tried to grab one. The fish darted away. He tried again. Same result. The fish were fast, and the men were weak and slow from dehydration. Aldrich pulled out his pocket knife. He leaned over the edge and held the knife just under the surface, waiting. A fish swam close. Aldrich stabbed down. He missed. Another fish approached. He stabbed again. This time the blade connected. The fish thrashed. Aldrich grabbed it and flipped it into the raft before it could escape. The fish was maybe 8 inches long, silver, and desperate to get back in the water. Dixon grabbed the pliers and killed the fish by crushing its skull. Then he used the pocket knife to scale it. The 3 men divided every piece of edible flesh among them. Raw fish. No fire, no seasoning, just protein and moisture. It tasted better than anything Dixon had eaten in his entire life. The fish gave them maybe 2 ounces of flesh each, but it was food. The fish also gave them hope. If they could catch one, they could catch more. Dixon understood they might be in this raft for weeks. The realization was settling in now. Enterprise was gone. The Navy had moved on. No rescue was coming. They would have to save themselves or die trying. January 20th. Still no rain. The men's skin was blistering from sun exposure. Large patches of Dixon's back had turned dark red and then started peeling. Aldrich's face was swollen from sunburn. Pastula's lips had cracked so badly they bled when he tried to speak. All 3 men had lost noticeable weight. Their ribs were starting to show. A bird appeared. An albatross, huge and white, circling the raft. It came lower. Lower still. Then it landed on the edge of the raft and folded its wings. The bird weighed maybe 15 pounds. It represented more food than the 3 men had seen since ditching. Aldrich pulled out the .45 caliber pistol. He aimed carefully. 1 shot. The sound was deafening across the empty ocean. The albatross dropped dead. The men pulled it into the raft and immediately began plucking feathers. Underneath was meat. Real meat. Not just a few ounces from a small fish. They divided the bird into 3 portions and ate everything except the bones and feathers. The meat was tough and fishy tasting, but it was substantial protein. The gunshot had another effect. It attracted sharks. January 21st. Dawn revealed 3 large shadows circling the raft. Bull sharks, maybe 6 feet long, drawn by the blood from the albatross. They came closer. One of them bumped the bottom of the raft. Dixon felt the impact through the rubber floor. The shark bumped again, harder this time. The men pulled their arms and legs away from the edges. Aldrich made a decision. If the sharks wanted to investigate the raft, they would become food. He tied a cord from his life jacket around his wrist and leaned over the side with the pocket knife ready. A shark came close. Aldrich stabbed down and hit it in the gills. The shark thrashed. Aldrich held on. The other two men grabbed him and pulled. The shark was 4 feet long and weighed at least 60 pounds. It came halfway into the raft before the knife pulled free, and it slid back into the water, trailing blood. Another shark approached. This time, Aldrich was ready. He struck it in the same place, the gills, where the knife could penetrate. This shark did not escape. All 3 men hauled it aboard. The shark thrashed in the bottom of the raft for 30 seconds before Pastula killed it with the pliers. Dixon used the pocket knife to cut open the shark's belly. Inside was the liver, dark red and rich. They had all heard that shark liver contained vitamins. They ate it first. Then they carved the shark into strips and ate the meat raw. The shark meat was dense and oily. It sat heavy in their stomachs. But it was food, and food meant survival. The men had learned something crucial in 5 days adrift. The ocean could kill them, but the ocean could also feed them. By January 23rd, the shark meat had given the men strength, but created a new problem. The oily flesh made them desperately thirsty. Their bodies needed water to process the protein and fat, but no rain had fallen since the 18th. 5 days without fresh water. Dixon's urine had turned dark brown, a sign of severe dehydration. Aldrich had stopped urinating entirely. His kidneys were beginning to fail. The men had no choice. They began drinking their own urine. Dixon went first, collecting the liquid in his cupped hands and forcing himself to swallow. It was warm and bitter and foul-tasting, but it contained some moisture and no salt. Aldrich and Pastula followed. The urine provided minimal hydration, just enough to keep their kidneys functioning for another day or two. The sun continued its assault. By the 8th day adrift, all 3 men had second-degree burns covering their shoulders, backs, and legs. The burns cracked open and became infected from the constant saltwater spray. Dixon's back looked like raw meat. Every movement reopened the wounds. At night, they could not lie on their backs because the pain was unbearable. Sleep deprivation was destroying them as surely as thirst and hunger. The raft was too small for 3 men to sleep simultaneously. The constant battering from waves made rest impossible. By January 24th, Dixon estimated he had slept a total of maybe 3 hours since ditching on the 16th. His mind was starting to play tricks. He saw ships on the horizon that were not there. He heard aircraft engines in the distance that did not exist. January 25th, 9 days adrift. Another storm appeared on the horizon. This one was larger than the first. The clouds were black, and the wind was already building when the storm was still miles away. Dixon knew what was coming. He ordered Aldrich and Pastula to tie themselves to the raft with cords made from their remaining clothes. If the raft flipped, they needed to stay attached or they would be separated and lost. The storm hit at 3 p.m. The wind reached 40 miles per hour. The swells grew to 12 feet high. Rain came down so hard it felt like being struck with pebbles. The men opened their mouths and drank frantically. They had no containers, so they drank until their stomachs were bloated and painful. The fresh water was life itself. But the storm also tried to kill them. A wave lifted the raft 15 feet into the air and slammed it down into a trough. The impact knocked Pastula unconscious for several seconds. Another wave broke over the raft and filled it with 200 pounds of seawater. The men bailed with their hands, desperately trying to keep the raft from sinking under the weight. The storm lasted 47 minutes. When it passed, the raft was still afloat, but the men were barely conscious from exhaustion. January 27th, 11 days adrift. The men had developed saltwater sores on their hands and feet from constant immersion. The sores were open wounds that would not heal. Every time they reached into the ocean to catch fish or bail water, the salt burned like acid in the wounds. Aldrich's hands were so badly infected he could barely grip the pocket knife. Weight loss had accelerated. Dixon estimated he had lost 25 pounds. His belt no longer held up his pants. His ribs stuck out like bars on a cage. Aldrich had lost even more weight because he was younger and had less body fat to begin with. The radio man looked skeletal. His cheekbones protruded and his eyes had sunk deep into his skull. The psychological torture was becoming worse than the physical suffering. 3 men in a space 80 inches by 40 inches. No privacy, no relief, no escape. They could not get away from each other even for a moment. Every breath, every movement, every sound the other men made became an irritation. Dixon felt himself growing angry at Aldrich for the way he cleared his throat. Pastula snapped at Dixon for shifting position in the raft. The men were beginning to turn on each other. January 30th, 14 days adrift, 2 weeks in the raft. The men had drifted approximately 400 miles from where the Devastator went down. Dixon had no way to know this, but he could feel it. The ocean currents had pushed them steadily southwest. He tried to calculate their position based on the sun and stars, but without instruments or charts, it was just guesswork. Another bird landed on the raft. This time it was a smaller seabird, maybe 3 pounds. Pastula grabbed it with his bare hands before it could take off again. They killed it, plucked it, and ate it raw within 5 minutes. The bird provided barely enough meat for 1 man, but divided among 3, it was just a few bites each. Still, it was protein. February 1st, 16 days in the raft. Over 2 weeks since they had seen another human being or heard a human voice besides their own. The isolation was maddening. Dixon found himself talking to the ocean, asking it questions, begging it for mercy. He knew this was a sign of mental deterioration, but he could not stop himself. The raft itself was showing signs of wear. Small leaks had developed in 2 places where the rubber had worn thin from constant flexing. The men used the rubber cement to patch them, but the cement supply was running low. If the raft developed a major tear, they would have no way to fix it. February 3rd, 18 days adrift. The men had stopped counting hours. Time had become meaningless. There was only day and night, sun and darkness, thirst and brief relief when rain came. Dixon's sense of dates was slipping. He had to carve marks into the rubber with the pocket knife to keep track, but even that system was becoming confused. Hallucinations had started. Aldrich saw land on the horizon multiple times per day, mountains and beaches that existed only in his failing mind. Pastula heard voices calling to them from the water. Dixon saw his wife standing on the raft, clear as day, before she vanished. The men had learned not to react when someone reported seeing something impossible. They just nodded and stayed quiet. The human body was cannibalizing itself now. With almost no food intake for 18 days, their muscles were breaking down to provide energy for vital organs. Dixon's legs had become thin as broomsticks. His shoulder blades jutted out like wings. When he touched his own ribs, he could feel each individual bone with no fat layer between skin and skeleton. Bowel movements had stopped days ago. There was nothing to expel. The men's digestive systems had essentially shut down. Their bodies were conserving every molecule of energy for the brain and heart. Everything else was being sacrificed. February 5th. 20 days in the raft. The infections were spreading. Aldrich's hands had swollen to twice their normal size from the saltwater sores. Pastula had developed an infection in his left foot that made walking impossible, not that there was anywhere to walk in the raft. Dixon's back was covered in open wounds that attracted flies during the day. The flies laid eggs in the wounds. The men picked maggots from each other's backs every morning. But the maggots gave Dixon an idea. Protein was protein. He tried eating several of the larvae. They were disgusting, but harmless. The other men watched him for signs of illness. When none appeared, they started eating the maggots too. It was perhaps 5 calories of nutrition, but 5 calories was better than 0. Another storm arrived on February 7th, the 3rd major storm since ditching. This one brought winds near 50 miles per hour and waves that lifted the raft 20 feet into the air before slamming it down. Pastula was nearly thrown overboard. Dixon grabbed him at the last second and pulled him back. The storm lasted over an hour. When it ended, all 3 men were barely conscious. The storms were following a pattern. They appeared every 6 to 8 days, always from the east, always in the afternoon. The rain from the storms was keeping them alive. Without those periodic downpours, they would have died of dehydration before the 10th day. But the storms were also pushing them farther west, away from the islands Dixon hoped to reach. February 9th, 24 days adrift. nearly 4 weeks in the raft. The men had lost all sense of their former lives. Dixon could barely remember what USS Enterprise looked like. The concept of a solid deck beneath his feet had become abstract. The raft was their entire world now. They had been in it so long they could not imagine being anywhere else. Despair had set in. Aldrich stopped speaking entirely around February 8th. He just lay in the bottom of the raft and stared at the sky. Pastula talked to himself constantly, mumbling about food he used to eat and places he used to go. Dixon tried to maintain some discipline, some structure, but it was becoming harder every day. The sun rose on February 10th, 25 days since the Devastator went down. Over 3 weeks drifting in the Central Pacific with no rescue, no land, no hope of survival that any rational person would accept. The men were skeletons wrapped in burned skin. Their minds were failing. Their bodies were shutting down. Death would be a mercy. But then, on the afternoon of February 10th, something changed. The wind shifted. Instead of blowing from the east, it came from the north. The shift was subtle, but Dixon felt it. A north wind in this part of the Pacific meant they were drifting into a different current. The current might push them toward the Phoenix Islands or even the Ellis Islands. Both island groups had inhabited atolls. People, food, fresh water, rescue. Dixon did not tell the other men about the wind shift. He did not want to give them false hope, but he started watching the horizon more carefully, looking for birds, which meant land was near, looking for changes in the watercolor, which meant shallow reefs, looking for anything that suggested they were approaching the end of their drift across the Pacific. February 11th arrived. The men caught another fish. February 12th brought rain. February 13th was calm. The routine of survival continued, but the wind kept blowing from the north, and Dixon kept watching the horizon, and somewhere deep inside his failing body, hope tried to take root one more time. February 14th, 29 days adrift. Dixon woke to find Aldrich lying motionless in the bottom of the raft. The radio man's breathing was shallow and irregular. His pulse was weak. The infections in his hands had spread up his forearms. Red streaks ran from his wrists to his elbows, a clear sign of blood poisoning. Without antibiotics, Aldrich would be dead within days. Pastula was in marginally better condition, but not by much. The bombardier could no longer stand even when holding onto the raft's edge. His legs had atrophied from weeks of disuse and starvation. His left foot was grotesquely swollen from the infection. When Dixon touched it, Pastula screamed. Dixon himself had perhaps a week left, maybe less. His kidneys were failing. He had not urinated in 2 days. His body was shutting down systems one by one, conserving energy for the brain and heart for as long as possible. He estimated he had lost 40 pounds since January 16th. His weight had dropped from 175 pounds to maybe 135. The men were naked now. Their clothes had rotted away or been used for patches and cords. The tropical sun had burned their skin black in some places and left it peeling and raw in others. They looked like corpses that had not yet realized they were dead. February 15th. A bird appeared, not circling overhead, but sitting on the water about 50 yards from the raft. Dixon watched it. The bird was diving for fish, which meant the water was relatively shallow. Shallow water meant reefs. Reefs meant land was somewhere nearby. He did not tell the others. They were too far gone to understand, and he was too weak to explain. More birds appeared over the next 6 hours. First 1, then 3, then a dozen. They were feeding in the same area, diving repeatedly. Dixon knew what this meant, but his mind refused to accept it. After 29 days of empty ocean, the possibility of land seemed like another hallucination. The wind continued blowing from the north. The raft drifted south. The watercolor changed from deep blue to a lighter shade of blue-green. Definitely shallow water now. Dixon's heart rate increased despite his exhaustion. Land was close. How close, he could not tell, but close enough that the ocean floor was rising toward the surface. February 16th. 30 days in the raft. Exactly 1 month since the Devastator ditched. Aldrich regained consciousness around dawn, but could not speak. His tongue was swollen from dehydration, and his lips had cracked so deeply they no longer moved properly. Pastula was muttering about cornfields. Dixon was too exhausted to respond. The sky darkened in the afternoon. Another storm was building, the 4th major storm since ditching. This one came from the northeast, a different direction than the previous 3. The winds reached 40 miles per hour. The rain fell in torrents. The men drank until they vomited, then drank more. The storm pushed the raft violently to the southwest. When the storm cleared, the wind continued from the northeast, strong and steady. The raft was moving faster now, pushed by both wind and current. Dixon estimated they were traveling 3 to 4 miles per hour. In open ocean, that speed meant nothing, but if land was nearby, it meant they might reach it before they died. February 17th. The sun rose on the 31st day. Aldrich was still alive, but unresponsive. Pastula had stopped muttering and lay silent. Dixon's vision was beginning to fail. He saw dark spots that floated across his field of view. His hearing was muffled, as if his ears were filled with water. These were signs of multi-organ failure, the body shutting down. The waves changed. They were coming from a different direction now, breaking in a pattern that suggested obstruction. Dixon had spent enough time at sea to recognize the signs. There was land ahead, an island or an atoll blocking the waves and creating a different sea state. At 2 p.m. on February 17th, Aldrich spoke for the first time in days. His voice was a croak, barely audible. He said he saw corn. Dixon ignored him. Hallucinations about cornfields had become common. But then Aldrich spoke again. He said he saw something green. Dixon lifted his head and looked. At first he saw nothing, just ocean and sky. Then the raft crested a wave, and for 1 second he saw it. A thin line of green on the horizon. Palm trees. He was certain of it. Not a hallucination. Real palm trees on a real island maybe 5 miles away. The wind was pushing them toward it, but the wind was also pushing them past it. The island was to their left, and the current was carrying the raft parallel to the shore rather than toward it. If they drifted past, they would miss the island entirely and be swept back into open ocean. After 31 days adrift, they were about to miss their only chance at rescue by a matter of miles. Dixon grabbed what was left of Pastula's shirt and held it over the side as a crude sea anchor. The drag was minimal, but it was something. The raft slowed fractionally. The island grew larger. Palm trees became visible. Then a beach. Then individual rocks on the shoreline. The raft was going to hit the reef. The coral reef appeared 50 yards ahead. Dixon could see the waves breaking white against the sharp edge. The raft was moving too fast. If it hit the coral at this speed, the rubber would tear and they would be dumped into the surf with no strength to swim. But there was no way to stop. The current had them. The raft hit the outer reef at 4:30 p.m. on February 19th, 1942. The impact tore a 6-inch gash in the bottom. Water poured in. Dixon grabbed Aldrich under the arms. Pastula somehow found the strength to hold on to the raft's edge. The waves lifted them up and threw them over the reef into the shallow lagoon beyond. The raft was sinking, but it had carried them past the worst of the coral. Dixon's feet touched sand. Actual solid ground for the first time in 33 days. He stood up in waist-deep water and pulled Aldrich toward shore. Pastula crawled on his hands and knees through the surf. The beach was 30 yards away. Dixon's legs gave out after 10 steps. He fell forward into the water. He got up and took 5 more steps. Fell again. The beach was closer now. 20 yards. He could see palm trees clearly. Real palm trees, not hallucinations. He pulled Aldrich another few feet. Pastula was crawling beside them, still moving forward inch by inch. They reached the beach at 5:07 p.m. Dixon collapsed on the sand and lost consciousness. When he woke, it was dark and there were voices speaking a language he did not understand. Hands lifted him. He tried to fight but had no strength. The hands were gentle. Someone was giving him water. real fresh water from a container, not rain caught in cupped palms. The island was Puka Puka Atoll, part of the Cook Islands administered by New Zealand. The native inhabitants had seen the raft wash through the reef and came to investigate. They carried the 3 skeletal Americans to their village and gave them food and water in careful amounts. Too much food at once would kill men in their condition. Dixon, Aldrich, and Pastula had drifted approximately 1,200 miles across the Pacific Ocean in 34 days. They had survived on 2 birds, perhaps a dozen small fish, 1 shark, rainwater, and their own urine. They had lost a combined total of over 100 pounds. All 3 had severe infections, 2nd and 3rd degree burns, and multiple organ systems in failure. The village had a radio. The islanders contacted New Zealand authorities, who contacted the United States Navy. On February 27th, a consolidated PBY Catalina seaplane from USS Swan landed in the lagoon and picked up the 3 survivors. They were flown to American Samoa, then to Pearl Harbor for medical treatment. On March 18, 1942, Admiral Chester Nimitz presented Harold Dixon with the Navy Cross aboard USS Enterprise at Pearl Harbor. The citation praised Dixon for extreme heroism, exceptional determination, resourcefulness, skilled seamanship, excellent judgment, and the highest quality of leadership. Gene Aldrich and Tony Pastula each received presidential commendations for extraordinary courage, fortitude, strength of character, and exceptional endurance. Dixon was commissioned as an ensign later that year. He never flew another combat mission. He left active duty in 1946 and retired from the Naval Reserve as a lieutenant in 1950. He died in San Diego in 1987 at age 85. Gene Aldrich returned to duty and survived the war. He died in 1973. Tony Pastula also returned to service and survived. He died in 1982. The raft that saved their lives was sent to the United States Naval Academy Museum in Annapolis, where it remained on display for decades. It was later transferred to the National Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola, Florida, where it remains today as a testament to human endurance and the will to survive against impossible odds. 34 days, 1,200 miles, 3 men who refused to die in the Pacific Ocean. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor, hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about Navy airmen who survived with nothing but a pocket knife and will to survive. Real people, real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world. You're not just a viewer. You're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching. And thank you for making sure Dixon, Aldrich, and Pastula don't disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen.